Hello Mayhem Makers, I'm Mindy with Quilting Mayhem, and today I want to talk about the Anna Maria Horner block of the month. It is called Wheelhouse and it is using her fabric collection called Hindsight, and in month one she's having you do some fussy cutting and some large square cutting. So I want to make sure I do some tutorials for you to show you how to manage larger cuts and fussy cutting. And we're going to start with the first step of the medallion, which is making the 24.5-inch square out of this fabric. And so you see there are multiple size motifs of flowers, and she is having you cut a 24.5-inch out of the large motif. So make sure you lay it out and you pick which one is going to get you the whole 24.5 inches. And I'm going to then have you see how I lay it on the mat and how I attempt to get that 24-inch square block. So when working with fussy cutting and larger pieces, I like to make sure I have a friction pin for marking. I like it because it is heat erasable. And because we're trying to get a 24.5-inch square, I'm going to try to determine what my center of this motif is going to be. So as you can see, I have my 24.5-inch ruler. So it's going to give me my guide as to where my top of my block and bottom of my block are going to be. So I'm going to do a little shifting, a little shimmy maybe, and go, okay, how much down below do I want? Well, maybe I want it a little lower so I can make sure that I get this bottom flower, and just kind of keep doing a little shifting. This way I know how that block's going to look. Now, if I want to make sure this flower itself is dead center, I may shift it more this way and find center of my ruler at 12 3/4 and just place it dead center in that flower. If that's the route I want to go, I would then kind of draw a line for my center, and you may not be able to see it, but just trust me, that's what we're going to go with. And then I'm going to take my smaller ruler and try to essentially draw a X marks the spot as to where I want my center to be. So part of it's going to be deciding how you want your center medallion to look. Do you want more of the full motif, or do you want it more dead centered on this main flower print? From here, we can then start to figure out how to make our big 24.5-inch first cut. I have the fabric, so the width is going away from me, top to bottom, and then you have a whole large piece. All right, so I found my center. I now need to at least get my fabric manageable on my cutting mat so I can start to cut one 24.5-inch section out of this fabric. That to me is what's going to be the most manageable, and the rest of the fabric that comes in this kit you're going to put aside and save for a step further down in this block of the month program. It'll show up in a different month. So don't throw away any extras. You're going to need it later. So we're going to fold it in half. And I'm trying to keep my center of my flower straight. And unfortunately, it's a lot of fabric to manage. Now, I am making sure that I use a mat that's 24 by 36 so that I can get both sides of my 24.5-inch cut at the same time without having to shift any fabric, to try to keep my block edges straight. So with this in mind, I'm just going to straighten, play with it, and then line it up on the numbers of my mat so that I know where the center is going to be from each side to cut my strips. So I'm actually deciding to place my center at 15, and that way, because I have a larger ruler to work with, I can measure from the 15 up the 12 3/4 that will get me to one side of my block, and then I'll be able to measure 12 3/4 the opposite direction so that I will have a 24.5-inch strip cut out of the middle of this fabric that should still have my motif centered. So that's where I'm going to start. And because I have the fold lined up on the mat, I know everything should be straight. So we're just gonna double check everything nice and neat, count my way up my mat to my 12 3/4, and then I'll make my first cut. Now, if you're a little nervous about this, there's always the option where you can mark both sides and then measure in between. So you can take your friction pen, draw your line up one side, come down to the other side, draw your line down the other side, and then measure just to guarantee that you've done your math correct, because you don't want to have it be too short. It can always be a little big and you can trim down. So if anything, you can even cut a little larger and go up 13 inches so that in the end, if you need to do any fixing, you have a little bit of forgivable room to trim up your square in the end. I'm gonna go for gold and just cut my strip at my 12 3/4, and then I'll work down to the other side. And really the easiest way to cheat, if you don't mind moving fabric, is I'm actually just gonna turn it, realign everything back up, and this way I can line up my cut edge on my 0 line, I can do my folded edge on the top, and then I actually can come to my mat at 24.5 and just cut that. Once again, if you're nervous, feel free to do some markings first or cut a little big, and then that way you can trim down in the end. So now I have one large 24.5-inch strip. The next struggle will be to make it square. So I'm going to take it apart, line my cut edges up, and essentially redo that same process of finding where my 24 3/4 is going to be on one end and then turning it and doing 24.5. Or I could just take it down, line it up, and try to trim off both the left and right hand sides. I don't have a whole lot of room to my left in this demo station, so it's a little easier for me just to do it kind of this route at this time because of the workspace I'm working with here. But certainly for you, go find 12 3/4, line up your X marks the spot, and then cut at 0 and at 24.5. So there's several ways to do these kinds of things. It's a little more nerve-wracking than how it really is. You get a little scared about doing these large cuts, and sometimes you just need to go for it. So I've done that step. So I can trim, and then I can turn it and trim again. I do recommend before you do your cutting that you do good pressing on it, and I usually like to use Best Press or flatter starch spray to make sure that the fabric is nice and crisp and it doesn't do as much wiggling on you as you do your cutting. So go to 24.5, cut off my excess, and now I will have my large center medallion. And this is your step 1 of this month's block of the month sew along. Next, I'll show you how to do fussy cutting with Anna Maria's templates. Thank you for following along in my tutorial today, showing you how to create the center medallion for the Anna Maria Horner Wheelhouse Block of the Month. Stay tuned for part 2, where I will show you how to do the fussy cutting with her templates that come as part of your subscription kit. Happy stitching!